Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson Institute. A couple of housekeeping matters before we move on to the main program. First of all, the next session will be next week, July 18th, when Professor Bruce Owen of Stanford University will come to speak about one of my favorite topics, corruption. And that should be a lot of fun, and everyone is invited to that. Today, we're very honored to have with us Daniel Weitzner, who is Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. Mr. Weitzner is responsible for Internet policy for the administration. He has a long and distinguished career focusing on Internet policy for as long as I've known Danny, which is much longer than either of us would probably like to admit. He has had a long and distinguished career moving higher and higher in the Internet policy world, and frankly, I'm not quite sure what the next step will be, but it will be a wonderful step, I'm sure. So we're very pleased to have Mr. Weitzner come speak to us about the administration's Internet policy. We'd also like to welcome the viewers on Ustream. You can submit questions to us via Twitter at Hudson Institute. And Mr. Weitzner has very graciously agreed to speak to us for probably 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A after that.
Harold, thanks. Appreciate it. So thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. My thanks to the Hudson Institute. I understand that Ken Weinstein is off on Middle East Peace, so I'm really glad that someone is attending to that. We are grateful for the help there. I'm so pleased to be here with Harold. Harold, I can remember Harold on the commission when, just a very small number of years ago, of course. I had the same amount of hair. I can't account for yours. And I really always appreciated Harold's very thoughtful, careful look at the time, what seemed at the time like rapidly evolving, very exciting technological possibilities. I think, in all candor, we'd have to admit we didn't imagine the half of it back then. And I think that that's really, in some sense, the perspective that we as an administration bring to Internet policy questions, which is that we hope we have not yet imagined the half of it. The extraordinary thing about the Internet has been the way that it has been able to develop. It's been, as you all know, a very unique combination of private sector initiative, very careful, if not always precisely intended, government research investment decisions, some very smart, subtle regulatory policy moves, but really an environment that just has enabled extraordinary innovation that continues on. And our goal really is to make sure that the environment stays that way, that we come back here 10 or 15 years from now and could say, wow, we didn't imagine the half of it. The Internet has been a priority for us as an administration, not just as a source of commercial innovation, it clearly is that for us, but also because we recognize that it's been a platform and will continue to be a platform for extraordinary social innovation, for extraordinary transformations in the political process. I think that it's fair to say, now that we're kind of in another election season, it seems like it's come up awfully quickly, that while there's no sense in which this president was elected by the Internet, certainly the early days of his campaign back in 2007 really critically depended on the Internet, his ability as a somewhat insurgent candidate to be able to get the word out, to be able to organize people against what were regarded as very considerable odds. we think really was facilitated in very significant ways by the platform that the internet creates. We also depend on the internet for helping to realize very key national priorities, whether it's the use of health information technology or healthcare reform, the use of personalized education systems for education reform, or smart grid technology to help with our energy policy and conservation efforts. The style of innovation that the internet has enabled is really critical to all those efforts. But I want to just focus your attention for a moment at how significant the internet is as an economic force, and why we think it's so important to take it seriously, both as a matter of national priority and also as a matter of global policy priorities. Estimates from the McKinsey Institute are that something like 26% of GDP from the top 15 OECD economies is dependent on the internet. Now, you have to be a little careful about these statistics, because the internet is not in and of itself a sector. It's a horizontal set of activities that supports all kinds of economic development. But if the internet were a sector, the estimates based on OECD data is that it would account for about 3.4% of GDP. It would be just a little bit larger than the education sector, just a little bit smaller than the transportation sector. So we're dealing with a slice of the economy that's really quite significant, and we've, I think, over time, evolved a public policy approach to this part of the economy, to this part of society, that we think has worked extraordinarily well, but that we have to really focus on carefully in order to maintain. The internet's not just a source of growth, but it's that growth also creates jobs. Recent estimates suggest that there are somewhere over 450,000 people employed just in the apps development sector. That's up from 0 people in around 2006, 2007, when there really weren't these things called mobile apps. So that's a huge set of job creation activities that we have there. Because we've created the right kind of open platform, we've enabled the right kind of open platform for development of this part of the economy. And interestingly, those jobs are more widely spread around the country than you might expect. Obviously, a significant proportion of them are in California, in Northern California, but they're also throughout Massachusetts, throughout Illinois, throughout Georgia, in Texas. Even D.C. has become a little hotbed for the apps economy, and evidently the government of the District of Columbia is falling all over itself to make sure that there are favorable tax environments, to make sure that companies like Living Social stay here, and make sure that other countries consider coming here. And I think that's a great result. It does bear remembering, though, that the internet really arrived to a very large extent without government planning. It did, as I suggested, I think, arrive because there was some very smart research and development investments made early on. Those were shepherded quite carefully. It's easy to look back at those and say, oh, well, those were exactly the right ones, and all that other R&D that we spent, well, we didn't need to do that. I don't think you have the luxury of that. So we continue to believe that long-run R&D investment in the technology sector and other areas of basic science is critical, and we're convinced that that the internet would not have happened without that kind of investment, and we're committed to continuing that kind of investment so that we see this sort of long-term growth continuing. As you know, though, a lot of the basic architecture and the basic technology of the internet was developed really with a very unique set of institutions. It was by no means activity that was the result of government fiat or government permission or regulatory structure. It was really activity in many ways that happened around the edges of an existing regulatory structure that took advantage of points of flexibility and targets of opportunity. So you had engineers, some of whom worked for big companies, but I would submit most of those big companies didn't know what their engineers were doing, went to places like the Internet Engineering Task Force and later the World Wide Web Consortium to lay the groundwork for the internet. You had organizations like ICANN that developed, that helped to handle the administrative arrangements. And all of these institutions are non-governmental institutions. They're globally distributed. They may have concentrations of people in certain parts of the world, but they are by definition global institutions open to anyone to participate. Governments are invited to come have a seat at the table, but certainly have no controlling role in any way in these underlying technical and administrative institutions. And we see these institutions scale up really in a quite extraordinary way. All you have to do is think of some of the technical standards organizations that, again, really were quite marginal activities, clearly populated by very smart men and women who had great engineering sense, but they didn't set out to build global networks. Any of them who tell you that they did, I think, are probably looking back with a bit of kind of self-aggrandizement. The honest ones will tell you they really didn't understand the scale of what they were doing, but they did it in a way that it could scale up, and they did it in a way that the technology could evolve with adequate speed and adequate flexibility. And as we look at the challenges that the internet poses to us today in the public policy environment, whether it's challenges in addressing consumer privacy, challenges in addressing cybersecurity, online copyright protection, we think that that we have a lot to learn from looking at these institutions, from looking at how the internet has developed to date, to bring some of those same institutional styles, some of those same attitudes about how to innovate from the technology world into the public policy world. And I'll talk about a couple of specifics, but I want to identify three key characteristics that we see in the internet environment that we think any public policy framework really has to account for and has to support. And the first is simply scale. Lots of people who come to, who in the past, when Harold and I were younger and more attractive, lots of people who started to look at the internet came from a telecommunications regulatory background or maybe a broadcast regulatory background, somewhere in the communications policy world, and brought a regulatory perspective, or at least came from a regulatory perspective that was really developed for a set of monopoly institutions, or certainly very large industrial organizations that were susceptible to a relatively traditional kind of command and control regulatory structure. I think what we understand today is that in this world where we have thousands and hundreds of thousands of apps developers, entrepreneurs spread out all around the world, that if we want that kind of innovation to continue to flourish, we can't expect those innovators to figure out how to all come in their hundreds of thousands to Washington or to Brussels or to Berlin or Beijing or whatever other government capital and set up shop and hire a lot of lawyers and lobbyists and figure out how to interact with this system. That may have worked, and that does still work in some ways for more highly concentrated industries. There's nothing wrong with that regulatory style from our point of view. But what we should recognize is that it doesn't fit the internet environment. And we learned that from the very beginning, really, in 1996, 97, when the U.S. Congress sought to regulate content on the internet for the first time. Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, which was a particular kind of internet censorship in the name of child protection. And this law was struck down pretty quickly in 1997. There are a couple of people in this room, Peter, who were involved in that. And I think that what we learned was, along with an important set of principles about free expression, we also learned that the regulatory fit between the internet and some of the more traditional models just wasn't quite there. And I think some part of what the Supreme Court reacted to when they expressed concern about speakers' inability to comply with regulations was not even so much the content of the regulations, but the form and the kind of regulatory environment that was involved. So dealing with the scale of internet innovation is a critical first principle. Secondly, I think we understand we have to have a public policy environment that can accommodate and indeed encourage the very rapid speed of innovation that we see in the internet environment and that we hope to continue to see. I think if you look at the pace at which new business models have developed, you look back about 6 years, there was no Facebook, there were no social networks really. You look back 6 years before that, there was no Google, no search engine really to speak of. And you look back 6 years before that, there was not even a commercial internet. You had to be an anointed member of the academy or a government employee in order to even get on the internet. So in a very short period of time, we've seen a number of business models develop. I think despite all the efforts that the traditional regulatory process can make to operate efficiently and rapidly, you can see that if you have a regulatory agency that has a specific statutory grant of authority and has to go through a rulemaking process, and then that rule may be challenged through a judicial process, and Congress may have to come back and look at it again, and then it goes back to the agency, and you go through these cycles despite everyone's best intentions, despite a well-working process. You have rules that just may well not keep up with the pace of innovation. And from our perspective, that hurts not only innovators, but it also hurts consumers. It hurts citizens. So keeping speed is really quite critical. And then finally, I think we all understand that the reach of the internet environment is instantly global. Anyone who does business on the internet is immediately what we used to call a multinational corporation, do business everywhere. And so it's very important that we create a global environment that supports open internet marketplaces all around the world. Because of the concern about the scale that I mentioned, it's clear that everyone who has a business on the internet can't go and figure out how to open offices in 193 countries, can't go and hire compliance officers to figure out all the different rules that there are country by country. So we need some kind of convergence on common approaches. I will submit to you, though, that we are highly unlikely to all of a sudden have global treaties on any of the difficult privacy policy issues that we face. So we need ways to evolve towards global standards that can be flexibly applied nonetheless. Let me talk just a little bit about how we've tried to incorporate these three requirements, scale, speed, and reach, into our policymaking efforts. And I'm going to phase back and forth a little bit between domestic issues and international issues, trade issues. It's often pretty hard to separate these two in the internet environment. We did start off in May 2011. The president released his international strategy for cyberspace. This is a very broad and kind of high-level framework for approaching internet policy issues in the U.S. And around the world. We very quickly took those principles to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, working with the 34 OECD member countries. We had a large ministerial conference on the internet economy in June 2011, and by the end of 2011, there were a set of principles that emerged from that conference that became an OECD recommendation. These principles are commitments to ideas such as global free flow of information, use of the multi-stakeholder policy development process to develop enforceable codes of conduct, transparency and accountability, principles that you support for intellectual property protection, limitations on internet intermediaries' liability, a whole series of principles that we've learned in the U.S. and I think we've learned in dialogue with our allies in the OECD that are important to the development of the internet economy. One observation about the OECD effort It's interesting to note that though the OECD itself is a treaty organization, it's one of the three Marshall Plan organizations along with the IMF and the World Bank. The OECD has no power to bind its members to any particular commitments or activities, but we thought that the soft law power of the OECD was a very important place to start a global internet policy discussion for two reasons. First of all, we think that's in many ways in the spirit of the internet environment generally, that the internet works because people come together on a voluntary basis, making commitments to voluntary technical standards, to voluntary operating procedures, and we thought extending that in a voluntary way to a set of public policy approaches is important. But secondly, the OECD, as it happens, has become a relatively popular place these days. We have a number of other countries that are looking to join the OECD. Russia is in the process of accession. Brazil, India, a number of other countries have expressed interest in participating in the OECD. Being an OECD member is kind of a global investor's seal of approval. It suggests that you have a set of economic and social policy frameworks that are good for investment and good for economic growth. And so these internet policy principles, while they don't constitute treaty commitments in a formal sense, they do constitute the price of admission to the OECD for countries that want to come in. So they create so any country that wants to join the OECD has to demonstrate to the existing OECD members how it is consistent with these principles. We're already finding that this is an important tool, and I'll come back and talk about some of the trade commitments that we're working on that build on these OECD principles. I think that I want to focus a little bit more carefully on the consumer privacy policy work that we've done as a way to illustrate what we think are the important components of our internet policy model. As many of you know, in February we released at the White House the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. This is a broad set of privacy commitments, privacy principles that we think are important for consumers to be able to have to rely on, and we think that companies ought to provide. We are using the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights in a two-step process. We've begun right away. The president called on companies in the internet environment to use the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and to implement those principles in specific enforceable codes of conduct that are developed through a multi-stakeholder process that will be convened by the Commerce Department. In fact, Thursday, the Commerce Department is holding the first meeting of a broad stakeholder process to develop a code of conduct for mobile apps privacy policies, to take the broad set of principles that we articulated in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and implement them in a specific code of conduct that would be developed with input from stakeholders, from commercial stakeholders, from advocates, from regulators, from academics and scholars and others. The model, and then secondly, we've also called on Congress to take the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights as the foundation for a consumer privacy protection statute. We think that it is time that we have clear privacy protection in the commercial environment for consumers. We feel very good about the privacy frameworks that we have in a number of sectors. In the healthcare sector and the finance sector, we have very strong privacy protections in a number of sectors. But in our work, we found there was a significant gap in the general commercial environment. We have an excellent enforcement agency in the Federal Trade Commission, but lack clear privacy enforceable privacy rights for consumers. We've called on Congress to take the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and develop them into a statute. Two things I'd observe about this framework. First of all, for us, the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights is a U.S. document. We don't necessarily think the entire world ought to pick it up word for word and adopt it. We recognize there's pretty significant difference in how different countries look at privacy. However, we were very careful to make sure that in drafting the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights that it's consistent with our international commitments through the OECD 1980 privacy guidelines, the APEC privacy principles that we've worked very hard to adopt. So we believe that these broad principles not only will be useful for domestic privacy considerations, but also to make sure that as U.S. companies develop their privacy policies, they're developing them in a direction that meet international standards, and that because of that ought to be recognized by other countries, which may articulate their privacy principles in different ways, but all of which have come together in places like the OECD to agree on an international set of principles. Our belief is that because we have these privacy principles based on a set of global principles that are widely adopted, widely shared around the world, that the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights can be the basis for increased global interoperability. This helps to make sure that we will have an environment in the internet where if a company, no matter where it's located, has a set of responsible privacy practices, it should know, and if it adheres to those privacy practices, and if it commits to make sure that they are enforceable, then it should know that it can move personal information around the world, it can do business around the world through these principles. Secondly, we have this broad set of principles, but we've been very clear that we believe it's critical that we have a flexible implementation mechanism for these principles. That's what we mean by these enforceable codes of conduct. Our goal is that companies should be able to take these broad principles and look at how they apply to an individual business model that they create. We chose to start in the Department of Commerce process with mobile privacy, but we certainly imagine these principles being applied in the social networking context, in location-based services, in any number of other kinds of service offerings that are available. We think that having that flexibility to take a broad set of principles, but then tune them to a particular business context is critical and provides the kind of flexibility that we think the internet needs. It also provides it on a timeline that we think will be more effective than a traditional Administrative Procedure Act style rulemaking process. What we've done, if you look at our model, is in some ways to flip the APA model almost 180 degrees. The APA model generally gives a regulatory agency the authority to write certain rules, and then the agency goes through a process of developing rules. It's a time-tested process. What we've done is instead, we've said there should be some general enforceable principles in statute, and that it should be up to the industries involved to write those rules for their individual context in consultation with other stakeholders. And then we've called on Congress to provide, in this case, the Federal Trade Commission, a safe harbor process by which the FTC can decide, really just on an up or down basis, whether a given company or a given industry's implementation of the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights is consistent with the broad statutory requirements. We think that that's going to result in a much more rapid process of developing rules, good for consumers, good for business, and also one that enables companies to tune the rules to the new business models that they're creating rapidly. I want to allow time for questions, so let me move quickly to how we see this applying globally. I mentioned that we worked very hard to gain support for the OECD Internet Policymaking principles. We've now taken those principles, key parts of those principles, and brought them into the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. So specifically, the TPP, as you probably know, is a comprehensive trade agreement that we are working on with our allies around the Pacific Rim. It covers a whole variety of sectors and a whole variety of issues. It's the first trade agreement that will address specifically internet and cloud computing services. And we've proposed a couple of provisions that I want to mention that are based very much on the principles we developed with our allies together at the OECD. First, we've said that TPP parties ought to avoid what are known as local data storage requirements. So we have U.S. internet service providers, internet platform providers, cloud computing providers, sometimes face the threat when they are trying to offer service in another country that the data or perhaps the whole application actually has to be hosted, has to be stored in that country. So that means if you're a U.S. Service provider, you can instantly more or less sell your services all around the world. But if countries start saying, well, yeah, the only way you can sell service to our citizens is to store the data in our country, immediately all of the economies of scale that we get from the internet and cloud computing, and frankly, a lot of the competitive advantage that U.S. companies have would disappear. If they have to build facilities in every single country, if they have to store data in every single country in which they provide service, we think that's really the end of the global internet marketplace, just as it's beginning. So we've proposed to our TPP negotiating partners that there should be a commitment to avoid local storage requirements. We've also said that it's very important to recognize that some of the key trade barriers that we will face in the internet environment are barriers that would have been known in the past as non-tariff trade barriers. That is, when the trade world was really all about who charged who what tariff, there was a little side set of issues called the non-tariff trade barriers. Those issues have really become the dominant issues in many ways in the internet environment. So requirements that countries may quite legitimately want to see affected, laws that help protect the privacy of their citizens, laws that help protect cybersecurity in their country, can end up as non-tariff trade barriers if every single country adopts a different set of rules, a particular set of requirements. You end up with really unacceptable compliance burdens for global internet services. So we've called on our TPP partners to have regulatory frameworks in place that will recognize when companies are complying with globally accepted standards for in areas such as privacy or security, so that rather than having to comply with all the precise requirements of any given country's law, if a company is complying with a globally accepted set of standards, whether it's cybersecurity standards or privacy standards such as those that are described in the OECD or the OECD privacy guidelines or the APEC privacy guidelines, that provided companies commit to those and commit to enforcement of those compliance promises, then the services should be allowed into those countries. So this is our effort to take what I think we've recognized has worked so well in the internet policy environment to date, and make sure that we have a global environment in which these services can actually be offered. You know, just coming back to the three requirements that I mentioned at the beginning, clearly, in the same way as the architecture of the internet was able to scale up from a very small academic networking exercise to a global infrastructure, we need that same kind of flexibility from our public policy frameworks, both domestically and globally. And I think you can see that in efforts that we've made through the OECD and now through the TPP. The internet's developed rapidly. We've been able to take advantage of tremendous speed, in some part because the technology is developed based on open platforms, and it's easy to add layers, add technologies on top that can work together without excessive coordination cost. We need that same kind of flexibility in our public policy environment. That's why we've called for these enforceable codes of conduct. We think those are rules that can be meaningful for consumers, that can provide certainty for companies, and that if they come with real enforcement commitments, we can have a speed of development of rules that matches the speed of the development of the technology and the business models. And finally, the global reach of the internet has been so important. It's important not just as a business matter, but I think we're recognizing how important it is as an instrument of our foreign policy, as a way to extend principles of openness and democracy and global participation in the governance process. In order to make sure that the internet continues to have that reach, that it doesn't start to balkanize based on different sets of rules enacted in different countries, we need increased global commitment to the principles of internet openness. We're pursuing that through the OECD principles, through a growing number of trade agreements. I've not talked a lot about the State Department's internet freedom effort. We think that's been tremendously important as part of the human rights dialogue to extend global recognition of human rights into the online environment. We put all these together, worked for about another decade, and Harold and I will come back and we'll hopefully feel like we've made some more progress. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience, from Twitter, however this works. I think I'll come back and sit down with you.
Please. Thank you very much. Well, I'll take the moderator's prerogative, Danny, and ask the first question. And that, I think, follows on to your last comment about the State Department's efforts. And I just wonder if you could tell us a bit about what's going on with the ITU and the administration's efforts to keep the internet free and open and not under the regulation of someone else.
Yes, it's a very important question. For those who are not aware, there are a series of proposals that have emerged over the last couple years from a body called the International Telecommunications Union. It is quite possible none of you have ever heard of this body. It's a part of the United Nations system. It actually predates the UN itself. It was originally created at the end of the 19th century as the International Telegraph Union to connect the national telegraph systems of countries, and it formed had a very important role for quite some time when the telegraph and then later the telecommunications networks were very much national in scope. In many cases, the telecommunication services, as you well know, Harold, were either state-owned or they were state-regulated monopolies, that is, nation-state regulated monopolies. There needed to be a mechanism for those national telecommunication systems to interconnect with each other, both to address the technical interconnection requirements and some of the financial arrangements involved in interconnecting phone systems around the world. And there's a treaty that is managed by the International Telecommunications Union that handles the interconnection of voice telephone systems. There are proposals to extend that treaty. There's a treaty that is called the International Telecommunications Regulations. There are proposals to extend the International Telecommunications Regulations to cover the internet in some way or another. There are a wide variety of proposals. Some of them are addressed at trying to deal with cybersecurity issues that arise in the internet environment. Some of them would propose to have the ITU itself get more involved in the technical standard setting for the internet or the administrative arrangements of the internet, that is, get involved in some way in the work that is now done, we think, very well by ICANN and the Internet Engineering Task Force and the World Wide Web Consortium. And then there are other proposals that would go towards regulating content to deal with what some people call harmful uses of information and communication technologies. We're very concerned about all these proposals. The ITU does a lot of things that are quite important. Among other things, it is a platform for international agreements on the use of the radio spectrum, something that we depend on quite a bit, and many countries depend on. But we think that any move to extend the traditional telecommunications regulations at the international level into the internet environment would be very disruptive of the innovation environment that the internet has been able to take advantage of. We think it would raise very substantial free expression concerns. The ITU is a one country, one vote system. We're not sure that we want to subject our free expression rights or anyone else's free expression rights to the to the majority vote of countries around the world. That doesn't always go very well, and we're not looking to do that. I would say that we have a very firm position that we do not want to see the ITU extend its reach. Part of the reason that we began work so early on the OECD Internet Policy Principles is they actually speak to the question of Internet governance and explain the ways in which the current Internet governance arrangements really work quite well. So we've been working to build a coalition of countries and also of private sector organizations that will make sure that the ITU doesn't extend where it's not useful and where it could do damage.
We have a question from Twitter from SLWORONA asks, the reason...
Nice to meet you, SL.
Okay. The reason other countries ask for local storage is the U.S. law enforcement policy of monitoring content stored here. Any comment?
So that is certainly the explanation that is offered when other countries suggest that local storage is better, that data about their citizens should be stored in their country. There's a widespread, well, I don't want to say widespread. There are those who will say that U.S. wiretapping law is inadequate to protect the privacy of data stored in the United States. We very firmly disagree with this view. While it is the case that some of our colleagues in Europe, for example, may say that they have tougher commercial data protection laws than we do, we can have that debate. I don't think that there's any debate to be had about the fact that U.S. Civil liberties protection against government intrusion, that the protection of the Fourth Amendment is absolutely the gold standard of privacy protection when it comes to individual civil liberties as against government intrusion. Every country around the world that we're aware of has provisions by which law enforcement and national security agencies can get access to personal information. When they're good provisions, they have adequate judicial supervision. They're done under the color of law. There's a accountability mechanism in place. We have all those. I think that any country that says they need to store their data in their own country as opposed to the United States would have a hard time making a case that they have better civil liberties protection than the United States does. I think that I think there's the argument may well go the other way, but we're very comfortable that we have good procedures in place that make sure law enforcement can get access on a judicially approved basis to personal information, but that we have strong civil liberties protection. And I would say that there are some cases in which some of the governments that make these statements about the state of the allegedly inadequate state of U.S. law seem to be working relatively closely with some of the vendors in their countries. So we do become concerned and wonder about whether there are any trade issues that arise there. We hope we can kind of nip all that in the bud. We have those principles laid out in the OECD principles. The TPP will I think, extend that. And we are working very hard to discuss with our allies the relative state of wiretapping law so that there's no misunderstanding about the protection that we have in the U.S.
I'm going to open it up to questions. I just ask the people asking questions to please identify themselves. Mr. Horowitz.
I'm Michael Horowitz at the Hudson Institute, and I want to follow up on Harold's question. Don't we really begin with the premise that closed society regimes like China will never permit any measure of openness? Hu Jintao has said that the stability of the state is dependent upon their capacity to purify the internet. Supreme Leader Khamenei has pretty much said the same thing. And I'm wondering whether the treaty process, even with the OECD, and I'm pleased about your remarks about the UN, really stand in the way of what ought to be a United States major Manhattan Project initiative to tear down the internet firewalls and bypass them of the world's closed society regimes. I'm troubled by some comments that have been in the press, for example, that people at the State Department have said, off the record to be sure, that if we really mount a robust program, it would cause China to go ballistic. I am concerned about the balancing that the State Department has to do between its policy objectives and this ultimate objective, which ought to be an American objective, to peacefully promote Western interests by tearing down internet firewalls. Now, the President made, and I'm really at the end of these comments, but the President made a remarkable comment in March about tearing down Iran's internet firewalls, and yet those of us who have been close to the situation have not seen any material change in what's been a go-slow policy of firewall circumvention. And I'm wondering whether and to what extent we should not be, and why we are not, mounting an objective that effectively says we want within the next 3 months, by supporting scalable, successful programs, to access 50 million closed society users to an unmonitored internet. The President made the speech, and I'm wondering why, for example, there isn't a robust effort that would allow the President 2 months from now to hold an interactive town meeting with 50,000 Iranian students or Syrian students or Cuban students or the like. Those of us who've been watching it have seen little in the way of action here, and I'm wondering about your comments.
Thanks. It's a very important question. I appreciate it. What I would say is that we have very extensive dialogues with a number of the countries that you mention. We're pursuing these both through the human rights dialogues and also through trade dialogues. I think that the expectation in the 21st century is that as a matter of commitment to free trade, countries will have to commit to open internet environments. We've taken a step that I'll point you to. Our ambassador to the WTO in Geneva last year asked China about a number of the questions that you're asking. How does the firewall work? How can legitimate U.S. businesses provide services through that firewall? How can we reach customers who are there? We are waiting for answers. We expect answers to be provided on this front. And what I would say beyond that is that if you look at the history of the development of the internet around the world, there is no question that there are significant pockets where there are real restrictions, and we find those restrictions unacceptable. I think it is also the case that the internet has been able to reach into countries, into societies, and provide people to direct access to information, the ability to participate in democratic processes, and indeed to fight for democratic processes. All you have to do is look around the Arab world and see this. So we will continue to push very hard on that. The State Department also has a series of programs working with human rights activists to make sure that they have access to secure communications facilities, that they're able to organize, that they're able to communicate with people outside of their countries. And we'll continue to work very hard on that, both on the free expression side and on the free flow of information side.
Well, I think you've actually answered our next Twitter question, which is from Bill Zeiser, which is, could you expand on the use of the internet for foreign policy, such as the Arab Spring? But I think we've got that. Next question over here. If we could wait till we get the microphone, and then please identify yourself.
Hi, Juliana Grunwald with
Hi.
National Journal. Hey, Danny. What are you hoping will come out of Thursday's meeting on the privacy codes of conduct? And then I have a second question. Given the struggles that states are facing in closing, their budget deficits, does the administration support legislative efforts to close the loophole left by the 1992 Cool decision on online sales taxes and requiring online retailers to collect sales taxes from out-of-state customers?
I'll answer the second question first. We haven't taken a position on Senator Durbin's bill at this point. To the first question, what do I expect to come out of the multi-stakeholder workshop that NTIA is hosting, that the Commerce Department is hosting? I expect a very robust discussion. I expect lots of people to be there expressing lots of views. I think we'll learn a lot about where the center of gravity may be on how to move forward on mobile privacy codes of conduct. And I think we'll get a sense of what it's going to take to make progress. We've got a very large number of people who've wanted to come and participate. We're very gratified by that. We have some of the advocates who have complained that they're worried that they may not have adequate access from outside of Washington. The Commerce Department's working very hard to make sure that there's a full participation. But I take that all as a very positive sign that people are invested in the outcome of the process, and we're certainly committed to making sure that everyone is heard and that we are able to develop codes of conduct through this process that can actually help address the privacy issues in that environment. Twitter is silent.
Twitter's silent. Could we follow up a bit on the tax question? And this has started to get a lot of attention, actually has for many years, just different state and local tax issues and the applicability of taxes on internet sales. Has there been much done internationally about that as well, in terms of coordination of across international lines, if you buy something online from a Canadian provider or the like?
I'm not aware of much. Obviously, there's sales tax is generally a local matter. So I'm not aware of any significant discussion
internationally
on that. No.
Question in the back.
Victor Stone. I was very surprised to hear you say that you are intentionally avoiding the Administrative Procedure Act because I understand that except for enumerated exceptions, it applies to the actions of every federal agency, and making rules through the OECD does not provide domestic law enforcement with any kind of statutes that they could enforce. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do you have a White House exemption from the APA?
I certainly didn't say that we're avoiding the Administrative Procedures Act. What I said is that in describing our privacy policy, which you can read about, that we are seeking a different model for rulemaking. What we are proposing is so first of all, we've asked for Congress to act. We're not proposing any unilateral rulemaking authority whatsoever. We have asked for Congress to enact the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights in statute, and then to have the Federal Trade Commission be able to review proposed policies that would comply with those statutory provisions. That itself that action of the Federal Trade Commission would certainly happen under either APA procedures or whatever procedures Congress decides are appropriate for that behavior.
Next question. Question up here.
Hi, Lynn Stanton, Telecommunications Reports. Once you get this first meeting under your belts, do you plan to proceed serially, finish with one code of conduct for one sector, one issue, and then move on to another? Or do you anticipate maybe being able to proceed concurrently on different issues?
We really haven't made that determination. I think we want to make sure that we're able to do one well. There's a fair amount of learning, I think, for everyone involved in doing this. I would also say that we don't claim any, kind of to the last gentleman's question, we don't claim any monopoly on this process. We're convening people to develop voluntary codes on an issue about which there was broad public interest, and we ascertained that public interest through a Federal Register process. We'd be delighted, I would say, if other organizations picked up the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and developed their own code of conduct for some particular context as well. To be very clear, though, those codes of conduct under today's legal framework are enforceable only through the FTC's Section 5 Unfair and Deceptive Practices Authority, or equivalent state authority where it's appropriate. What we're looking for, of course, is for Congress to provide the FTC, provide individuals statutory rights that they can seek enforcement of through the FTC.
Peter Davidson with Verizon. You talked, Danny, earlier about the dangers of kind of multi-jurisdictional regulations in the internet space, so kind of the balkanization of the internet through regulatory policies. So regulations are one way to skew behavior. Taxation is another way you can have many of the same problems in the taxation area. Harold mentioned the internet sales aspect, but the House Judiciary Committee just marked up the digital downloads legislation the week before the 4th of July, and that was voice voted out. Again, this kind of sourcing type legislation has been used very effectively in the mobile space, and now this is coming out with, and also, internet access, Internet Tax Freedom Act, similar types of things that have really kept some of those issues out. Are you supportive of the legislation that's been reported out of the Judiciary Committee, and that conceptually moving through Congress pretty quickly to get that out of the way?
We haven't taken a position on that, Peter, so I don't have a comment on it.
Danny, could you briefly describe, you've worked now both in the White House and at the Department of Commerce. Could you describe how internet policy gets coordinated inside an administration and just all of the different interests, and how do you go about doing that?
Sure. When we arrived in early 2009 at the Commerce Department, one of the things that we did first was to set up an organization called the Internet Policy Task Force inside the Commerce Department. It was an informal body. As people may know, the Commerce Department actually has an extraordinary set of expertise on technology policy issues between the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the International Trade Administration that has tremendous trade expertise in high-tech trade issues. The Patent and Trademark Office has significant intellectual property expertise. NIST has obviously technical expertise. So we did put together just in the Commerce Department a way to to work together on policy, on internet policy issues, and actually identified 4 areas: consumer privacy, cybersecurity, online copyright protection, and global free flow of information. That is the trade issues, really. And we're able to work together on all those issues. For a number of those issues, there are now also interagency groups that are organized in some cases through the National Science and Technology Council at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, again, that bring together all the expertise from all the different agencies. I'll make one comment about this. Unlike many other sectors of the economy that may have whole cabinet agencies or whole independent regulators associated with them, sometimes even more than one, the internet is unusual in that it doesn't have a focal point of government control. We actually think that's a good thing, but so we don't have a department of the internet, obviously. We're not proposing to create one. But it does pose certain challenges when an internet issue comes up and you say, well, where do you do it? Who would have something to say about it? So right away, for example, through the interagency groups that we've set up, we have the State Department and the Commerce Department and Treasury and some of the parts of the Pentagon. A number of different agencies will get involved in these issues. We also have significant expertise in the independent agencies, and they, of course, can do whatever they want, so we never tell them what to do, but we invite them to our conversations, and they often participate, which is valuable. So what you have is, the internet, I think we understand, is a really kind of radically horizontal environment across a large part of the economy. It's also horizontal across a large part of the federal government. And so we've worked to bring together all the different agencies that have interest. Same thing is actually true in the White House. You have interest in the National Security Staff and the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Trade Rep, et cetera, et cetera. So you do always have this challenge of reaching across lots of agencies to make sure that we get a broad perspective. But I'd say it's really worked quite well, and we've had coordinated efforts on a number of the initiatives that I mentioned.
We'll do one last question, and then question here.
Matthew Hussey with Senator Snow. I want to get back to the internet governance issue, and I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the impact that, let's say, the .XXX back in '06, PIPA, SOPA, StuckNet, Flame do to our efforts to ensure a free and open internet, globally. And then also I know that, the House and Senate have introduced resolutions. Actually, I think the House passed a resolution, was a non-binding resolution on, which was great to show bipartisanship. But I guess the concern is, given one of the, perceptions, whether rightly or wrongly, or premises for China, India, Brazil, other countries calling for this UN model, the ITU model, this one nation, one vote, is because of the perceived undue influence that the U.S. government has on internet governance, on ICANN. So can you talk about the impact that those issues might have on the diplomatic efforts and at WICA?
Can I just ask you to amplify your first question? You strung together XXX and SOPA and Stuxnet and a couple other things. I don't want to presume what you think is the common thread.
Well, again, because if you look at PIPA, SOPA, that there were provisions in there that required DNS filtering of copyright infringement, piracy issues. Right. Obviously Stuxnet's Flame. I mean, the U.S. government being involved in cyber warfare, if you will. I mean, sending out botnets, et cetera. And so I guess it's just a question of, if we're talking about this private sector-led model, which President Clinton had the great foresight to see, in pushing forward in the Green Paper and the White Paper. It's just, are we taking step backs because of some of these efforts by the administration, by Congress?
That's an excellent question. I think that I'll say that I don't think we're taking a step back. I think what we're recognizing is that the world of Ira Magaziner's white paper, which said, the private sector should lead in the internet environment, was, I think, exactly the right impulse at that moment. I think that since then, as many of these questions, your questions and others have illustrated, the internet has gone from a kind of a technological curiosity in the proverbial garage to critical, vital infrastructure for our societies. I think that some of the reasons that you see some of the countries coming to the UN to say, we need a treaty, we need UN control, is that they are uncomfortable with the idea that these private sector multi-stakeholder bodies can actually exercise adequate responsibility over an environment which has now become critical. Important. I don't mean to use critical in that sense, but has so I think that our challenge is to frame what we understand to be the proper role and responsibility of governments, and that is obviously to do things to make sure we have adequate cybersecurity in place, and I know you're working very hard on that. Make sure that we're protecting intellectual property, that we're protecting human rights, that we're encouraging the economy to grow, but that we don't step too far into the mechanics of how the technical standards are set, or how the administrative arrangements are organized. There's no question that we're in a, in some sense, from about 1 year after Ira Magaziner put out his paper in 1997, which said the private sector should lead. The next year, Congress passed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and that same year, 1997, Congress passed the Section 230 of the Communications Act, which provided liability limitations for internet service providers. Those were critical government steps, but they were very carefully calibrated. They were very carefully respectful of what was unique about the internet environment. When we see steps such as proposals from the ITU to just swoop in and take the whole thing and guide it or make sure it's reliable, we become concerned, because we think that we've had a very carefully calibrated balance of private sector initiative, government guidance, obviously rule of law underneath where we need it, and to lurch too far in one direction or the other is really where we think the risk is. I think that what is new, I think that what everyone's adjusting to is just getting that balance right, recognizing that there is and there always has been a role for government. There is and always has been rule of law underneath the internet. We just have to make sure that it's managed in a careful way.
And I apologize for the convoluted question.
Oh, no, not at all. It's a convoluted subject.
The reason I bring that up.
Yeah.
With respect, you hear Secretary General Touray, his recent quote saying the UN has no desire whatsoever to take up internet governance. I mean, yes, there are some modifications to the ITR regarding fees and routing, inside the nation's borders, but this overarching effort to encroach on like ICANN or IETF. It seems like there isn't any substantial evidence to support that. So I guess that's what I'm saying is, with this kind of megaphone
Yeah.
by various agencies, Congress or whoever, is it just kind of fanning the flames of what Russia and China?
No, I don't think it's fanning the flames at all. I think it's very important that the House expressed its views. I hope it'd be great for your side to join if you see fit. I do think it was actually a extraordinary little outburst of bipartisanship, which is always nice. Thank you, Shannon. I think I think what I would say is that we are clearly having a global dialogue on this topic. The end of that dialogue will be at a 12-day treaty conference in Dubai in December. Right now, it's interesting. I mean, there's the ITU issues are generally resolved in these kind of conference rooms in Geneva and other places around the world. What we're seeing is a much broader debate now. We're seeing a lot more governments concerned at a much higher level. We're seeing advocacy groups, we're seeing industry groups concerned at a much higher level, and they're talking about it publicly, and we think that's just great. That's the way things happen in the internet environment. It sometimes makes people a little uncomfortable. It's what we saw with the PIPA-SOPA debate. We thought that was very challenging, very constructive as well, because you had an awful lot of people who never paid attention to those issues having to think about how the actions of governments were going to affect their rights online, and we think that's an entirely positive activity. So all this public discussion that's going on, I think it's a part of the debate that we need to have. We've certainly encouraged it. We're participating in it. We hope other governments do. We encourage private sector stakeholders to, and I think it's going to get us to a better result.
And with that, I hope we have gotten to a better result. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.